So you join me on a very, very well snowy morning this today. Hopefully, we have a bit more snow for this weekend's good morning walk. Of course, that'll be the first good morning walk of the new year, and who knows what wonders that is and will to behold. I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about that particular morning. But I've made it no secret that I'm from Yorkshire and I'm from a town called Barnsley, a very, very big, massive mine industry heritage in this town. You can still see the coal pit heads, not from this view, but everyone knows where the coal stack is. Everyone can, see and go and see it. It's still there for all to see. And in and around Barnsley itself, there are mining villages, pit towns as they were called, pit villages. They're still there, they still exist, although be it in a far worse state because, well, essentially, mainly the Tories essentially destroyed the towns through getting rid of that heavy industry and not replacing it really with anything. Um, and unfortunately, we've seen through that period, even though that Labour did come in during the period during the 90s, things did slightly get better for these towns, but it was more for the fact that we were part of the European Union and had access to some of the European uh, town development funds, which, of course, from next year we have lost because, again, it sounds strange to say that we are, the the current fifth, and I say that with very trepidation because that's not going to last long, the fifth biggest economy in the world, yet we have regions in this town, and even I'm in this region, that are on an economic level almost comparable to, well, um, some of the worst economic deprived areas in Europe. And it is shocking to say that, but that is what has happened, and especially austerity has hit these areas even more incredibly hard. Even the 2000, again, we often don't talk about it really enough, but the 2008 crash did so much damage, and we've never ever recovered from that. Especially, the surrounding area that I'm in now has never really recovered from that 2008 crash, which really did a lot to push forward the whole Brexit debate. And then, of course, you got austerity added on top of that, which added to the whole mindset of, quote, being left behind. And of course, the EU had nothing to do with that. In fact, the EU, as I've said on so many occasions, was the only organisation that was putting money into these left behind areas. So we go to a very, very interesting story today from The Guardian because he is a guy who, I believe the guy who did it was a former miner, and he has now come back to these areas to track down like his former mining buddies and talk to them on what they think, especially after the last election. So before we get into that, please do remember to hit that like and share button, and of course down below there is a link to my Patreon page as well as a one-off donation link, and thank you very much to the people that do support me that way. So this comes from The Guardian, and the title is, "If anyone had said our mining town would go Tory, I'd have thought they were mad." So, I first met George Bell on the 20th anniversary of the 1984 to 1985 miners' strike, when he and many fellow miners had swapped the camaraderie of the coalface for jobs in the public sector and charities helping communities devastated by the closure of the local pits. He had become a homelessness officer for Bassett Law District Council in Nottinghamshire and was an active union branch secretary, using his skills from his days in the National Union of Mine Workers to fight for employees' terms and conditions when the council transferred its housing staff to a new organisation. Also, 2 decades on, I decided to track down Bell and the others, now in their 60s and 70s, to find out how the seismic shifts in this part of the East Midlands, where history of the mines and strikes still cast a long shadow, and had affected them and their families. He said, "If anyone had said back then that we'd go Tory, I'd have thought you were mad," says Bell, now 72. "Mind you, I could see the result coming. A lot of it was down to the anti-Corbyn rhetoric. A former fitter at Shire Oaks Colliery near Worksop, Bell is retired and volunteers on the Chesterfield Canal, a 46-mile stretch of water created in the 18th century to transport coal, which until last year ran through traditional Labour heartlands. Phil Whitehead, 61, had been an electrician at Shire Oaks as well. He went out canvassing for Labour at the last election and says he heard the two same things on the doorstep. I'm voting for Boris because he'll get Brexit done, and I don't trust that Corbyn. They didn't trust Labour to follow Brexit through enough, and believed the Corbyn caricatures in the tabloids. And I said it back then. There are a lot of these Corbyn caricature tabloids that he just could not shake and get rid of. And unfortunately, they did far more to damage Corbyn than anything else. And I said it very clearly and perfectly. You may not like Alistair Campbell, but Corbyn was in desperate need of an Alistair Campbell type figure to help him recreate his image. And that will unfortunately play a large part in our politics for some time to come. You know, we could get another Corbyn, a genuine guy who wants to actually help the poor and working class of this country, and the media will just tear him to shreds. And there will go yet a possibility of another very good leader that we could have had. Anyway, it continues. Whitehead gained a sociology degree and an MA in housing when the pits closed, when he first entered at age 16. He had worked in senior roles for a number of housing associations across the region ever since. Born and bred in Worksop, I like that, once the area's industrial powerhouse, Whitehead believes the demographic changes also have a lot to do with Labour losing a quarter of its votes in Bassett Law at the last general election, and a 7% swing to the Tories in neighbouring Bolsover, where Dennis Skinner lost his seat after 49 years. Worksop was where the miners lived and had always voted Labour, but a lot of them are now dead, said Whitehead. They've been replaced by young families buying 4-bed houses in new upmarket housing estates who have little attachment to the area or its history. They're here because of the reasonable housing prices and the good links to the M1 and rail services to Nottingham and Sheffield, where there are decent jobs. The big employers locally are now out-of-town warehouses and distribution centres. A lot of it is low-paid, non-unionised work, says Bell. The electricians, the brickworks, the timber yards, and other industries that used to service the mines are now all long gone, and there are now at least 8 food banks in the town. Sitting in the living room of the council house he bought on the right to buy with a payoff when he left Shire Oaks, the irony is not lost on Bell that he benefited from one of Margaret Thatcher's flagship policies. He says he didn't know if he'd ever work again, so he needed to keep the roof over his family's head. He added, although he and his wife, Christine, a former care assistant, are comfortably off, he voted to leave the EU in the EU referendum, hoping it would be a catalyst for change for the area. I just thought things couldn't get any worse for a lot of people round here, and maybe it would lead to more internal investment if we left. Nope, that's not going to happen. And again, you notice, and I've said this continuously, a lot of the reason people voted to leave was to make their lives better. And you're going to hear this again. He's not going to be the only guy in this article that says that. And I have said there is going to be so much anger when this doesn't turn out that way. Because that was the thing that a lot of the Leave people were saying. Oh yes, we can, level up, these places. Well, that's not going to happen. We've seen Boris Johnson say that, but when it's come to actually doing it, hasn't actually happened. And there is going to be a lot of anger, which is why I have said we need not to gloat about how bad it is, because we've got to really turn rejoining into a very patriotic thing. I think it's very, very achievable, and we talked about that just last week. But there is going to be a lot of anger, and if we let those people get swooped up by the likes of Nigel Farage, it is going to make a lot. It's not going to even be good for them because they are going to scapegoat minorities and other people, and we're about to see later in this article just how bad that is getting. So anyway, it continues. Whitehead was also another Brexiteer. He says, "I was never a lover of the EU. I always thought it primarily represented the interest of bosses, big businesses, and banks. It rarely did anything for the ordinary people." And again, I guarantee you, his area was in a massive receivement of EU, business development grants and things like that. But of course, again, no one talked about them. I accept that it could initially put the British economy in a tough position, but I thought we could get a deal like Norway has. I never voted leave for a no deal. Again, one of the things we've also said, if you got 5 leavers, just picked 5 random leavers from around the country, and you asked them what leave meant, even individually, none of them would agree. Because Boris Johnson, at the 2016 referendum, was very upfront that we would not be leaving the single market or the customs union, and that we could be like Norway, and that would fulfill the leave section of the referendum. That, again, hasn't turned out to be true. Once again, the justification of the, quote, will of the people is being used to justify things that no one really actually voted for. Now, Whitehall said, "I would probably vote differently, if given the opportunity again. Also, we underestimated how it has also, some ways, and this is where I was getting to, in some ways, legitimized xenophobia and racist opinions." Bell agrees. "We've opened a Pandora's box. In the pub, they'll say things like, if they, the foreign workers, are in our factories, we haven't got control. We want them out. Brexit is our way of getting those people back to where they came from," another person he's heard said. "And I often challenge them, but it gets real nasty. People feel emboldened to say things they wouldn't have done before." But Adrian Guilfoyle of 69 and Dave Potts, 97, who worked at Bassett Law's Melton Colliery, the last coal pit to close in 1994, don't regret their decision to vote leave. "Why should we do what other countries tell us? All these foreign countries want to do business with us. They can't afford not to. Most people don't like change, but they'll get used to it," says Guilford, who is semi-retired from the collier caretaker job he still loved after 17 years. It will change very drastically, and it will make it a lot harder for businesses to be competitive in what is a very much larger market. And that will also mean British businesses will not be as competitive in Europe. Again, we've locked ourselves out of a very big market. For Potts, who was sacked from Melton after being jailed during the strike in 1984, the betrayals during the miners' strike still loom large. "Arguments about how we're stronger together, staying in the EU, don't hold true," he says. "I've come from a miners' strike that fell apart. We don't stand together." Although he voted Labour 12 months ago, Potts has since left the party after 40 years, including a stint as a local councillor. He is disillusioned with politics. "I look back and realise they've done nothing for us. Too many politicians, it's the career that's important to them, not the people they represent. We seem to be forgotten." Potts was out of work for 8 years before the North Notts FE College employed him to coordinate support for students, and his family waited for a counter house for over 27 years. "That uncertainty takes its toll on your mind," says Potts. A stroke 7 years ago forced him to retire from the Bassett Law Learning Centre, where he was working with pupils excluded from school. John Scott, 73, another ex-Mallinton miner, worked for a local charity providing second-hand furniture for homeless people and people on low incomes. When the funding for his post as deputy manager and then the volunteer coordinator ran out, he stayed on as a driver until he retired 8 years ago. Since then, he's volunteered for other furniture projects and was a local ward councillor for a term. He says he was one of the few people here that he knows who voted both Remain and Labour. Yet once the country voted to leave, however, he believes Labour should have accepted the decision and fought for a proper deal. He is in no doubt that the party's position cost it its 2019 election. No one understood what Labour stood for. Lots of my friends voted Tory for the very first time just to get out of the EU, he says. A poll for Channel 4 earlier this month of 45 red wall seats won by the Tories in the North and the Midlands in 2019 found that 16% of the 2019 Conservative voters say that they do not know how they would vote now, while 7% say that they would switch back directly to Labour. Many cited the confusing messaging over COVID and Dominic Cummings' trip to Bernard Castle as a reason for their change. Scott says while some of his friends may be less enamoured with Boris Johnson after his mishandling of COVID, Keir Starmer has still to prove himself. I've said this before about Keir Starmer before. Each July until COVID struck, the men I usually spoke to make the great journey up to the Durham Miners' Gala, where some 200,000 people gather on the second Sunday of a month to commemorate the country's rich mining heritage and show solidarity and reminisce with old friends. I usually end up singing in a bar somewhere with George, says Dave, and a gala committee member. I'd spoken to Anderson back in 2004 when he'd gone from being a fitter at the Epsom Colliery in Durham to a care council servicer for the Newcastle City Council. He then worked nationally for Unison and in 2005 became Labour MP for Blyden in Gateshead. He stood down in 2017. The North East has also seen profound changes in the politics of its residents. During the EU referendum campaign, he recalls having a Remain stall in town, which was quickly dismantled when it became apparent his supporters were going to vote for Brexit. I didn't want to antagonise them and weaken Labour's chances at the next election. He explains that they hung on with just a majority of 5,000 in 2019. Our part of the country benefited from huge amounts of EU money for infrastructure, but people don't realise that. They stopped listening to the arguments to stay in. Voting leave was a emotional response to a feeling that they'd been betrayed for over 30 years. If there had been more working class MPs listened to in the Blair years, it would have been different, but he ignored them. He took them for granted, and that people in this part of the world would always vote Labour because they had no alternative. People say to me, it must have been awful working down the pit, says Anderson. Don't get me wrong, most people's standard of living and health are miles better off now than they were in the 70s, but people felt secure for everything, for what they had, and then everything that looks rosy going back. That's certainly true for Potts, who says nostalgically, I stand in the square in Durham on Saturday morning of the Miners' Gala when all the banners go past, and I just think, how the hell did we ever lose the strike? I just can't imagine it. As for Whitehead, he believes Thatcher has finally achieved what she set out to do when she took on the miners almost 4 decades ago in Labour's heartlands. Today they feel they owe their allegiance to no one, he says, and ultimately her legacy has fragmented and individualised society. And yeah, in a way that's so true, but you know, the Conservatives are certainly not going to do anything for these areas. Like I say, the local elections in, obviously they move to May of next year, are going to be interesting. As we've said before, many, indeed some of the interesting calls are coming to try and dismantle some of the local parish council areas that are heavily voted Labour, because some of these MPs are so worried about having a Labour council, but a Labour, being a Conservative MP, that they are going to be massively undermined when it comes to their election chances in a couple of years' time. And that is probably ultimately true. Some of these guys are going to lose their seats. They got a very, very slim majority and next time, they are going to have to be trying and selling that their deal was good for the country when it won't have been, that Brexit was a success when it won't have been, that they have, quote, levelled up with the North and they've kept their promises on that. They won't have. COVID will obviously still be around, an important issue. By then, we will have hopefully had the public inquiry into just what went wrong, and that will absolutely slay the Tories. So, personally, I'm probably hoping, although I don't think it will happen, I think Starmer has the ball. I think he's going to stumble with it, and unfortunately, I think we're going to see a Tory government again, possibly next election, although be it a lot more slimmer majority, probably. But again, we'll have to see. But I obviously hope that we will unseat the Tory government and that they will be, shall we say, receive an absolute thrashing. That is the hope that I have. But obviously, we've got to have a look at and be realistic sometimes. And, hope for the future. But, fingers crossed. And of course, as always, thanks for watching. Please do remember to hit that like and share button on your way out. And of course, down below there's a link to my Patreon page and a one-off donation page. And thank you all for watching. And of course, we'll see you next time.